The International Conference on Harmonization Good Clinical Practice, or ICH GCP, is an international, ethical, scientific, and quality standard for the conduct of trials that involve human participants. The guideline provides a unified standard to facilitate the mutual acceptance of clinical trial data for ICH member countries and regions by applicable regulatory authorities. GCP should be the cornerstone for every clinical trial, thereby protecting the rights, safety, and well-being of participants and ensuring the trial's data is credible, accurate, and consistent with the 11 principles of GCP. For a full list of definitions, please refer to the glossary, which is available on this training page. The 11 core principles of ICH GCP are designed to provide a flexible framework within which to conduct a clinical trial. The first of these principles states that clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles originating in the Declaration of Helsinki and should be designed and conducted in a way to ensure the rights, safety, and well-being of participants. The second core principle states that informed consent is an integral feature of the ethical conduct of a clinical trial. This means that participation should be voluntary, consent must be freely given, and that participants or their legally acceptable representatives are well informed. The third core principle states that all clinical trials should be subject to independent review by an institutional review board, or IRB, or an independent ethics committee, or IEC. The fourth core principle stipulates that clinical trials should be scientifically sound for their intended purpose and based on adequate, current, scientific knowledge and approaches. The fifth core principle specifies that clinical trials must be designed and conducted by qualified individuals, that is, people qualified by education, training, and experience to perform their respective tasks. This may include physicians, nurses, pharmacists, scientists, ethicists, technology experts, trial coordinators, monitors, auditors, or biostatisticians, all of whom may be needed across all phases of a clinical trial. The sixth core principle states that quality should be built into the scientific and operational design and conduct of a clinical trial. This means that strategies should be implemented to avoid, detect, address, and prevent the recurrence of serious non-compliance with GCP, the trial protocol, and any applicable regulatory requirements. The seventh core principle outlines that clinical trial processes, measures, and approaches should be implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risk to participants, as well as to the importance of the data collected. These processes, measures, and approaches should also avoid placing unnecessary burdens on participants and investigators. The eighth core principle states that clinical trials should be described in a protocol that is clear, concise, scientifically sound, and operationally feasible. The ninth core principle states that clinical trials should generate reliable results. This means that the information generated in a clinical trial should be sufficient to provide confidence in the trial's results and support good decision-making. The 10th core principle states that roles and responsibilities should be clearly defined and documented appropriately. The final core principle, Principle 11, requires that investigational products used in a clinical trial should be manufactured in accordance with applicable Good Manufacturing Practice, or GMP standards, as well as in accordance with product specifications and the trial protocol. Remember, the rights, safety, and well-being of participants are the most important considerations when conducting a clinical trial. This is more important than the interests of science and society. To find out more about the 11 principles of GCP, refer to Section 2 of the ICH GCP Guideline, which is available on this training page. A sponsor is an individual, company, institution, or organization that initiates, manages, and finances a clinical trial. The sponsor has overall responsibility for the trial conduct. Sponsors are responsible for implementing risk-proportionate processes to ensure the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants and the reliability of the trial results. They should also confirm that sufficient resources are available to appropriately conduct the trial. The sponsor is responsible for selecting the investigator or institution and ensuring that they are qualified by education, training, and experience, and have adequate resources and facilities to properly conduct the trial. Prior to initiating clinical trial activities, the sponsor should determine the roles of qualified individuals and allocate their trial-related activities accordingly. The financial aspects of the trial should be documented in an agreement between the sponsor and the investigator or institution. A sponsor may transfer any or all of their trial-related activities to a service provider, such as a clinical research organization or CRO, in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Before initiating the clinical trial, the sponsor and the investigator should submit any required applications to the appropriate regulatory authorities for review, acceptance, and permission to begin the trial. The sponsor may consider establishing an independent data monitoring committee, or IDMC, to assess the progress of a clinical trial, including the safety data and the efficacy endpoints at intervals, and to recommend to the sponsor whether to continue, modify, or stop a trial. Quality management includes the design and implementation of efficient clinical trial protocols, including tools and procedures for trial conduct, to ensure the protection of participants' rights, safety, and well-being, and the reliability of trial results. The sponsor should adopt a proportionate and risk-based approach to quality management and identify risks that may have a meaningful impact on critical to quality factors. The sponsor is responsible for establishing and maintaining appropriate quality assurance and control processes to ensure that trials are conducted and data are generated, recorded, and reported in compliance with the protocol, GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements. Non-compliance with the protocol, SOPs, GCP, or applicable regulatory requirements by an investigator or institution or by members of the sponsor's staff should lead to appropriate and proportionate action by the sponsor to secure compliance. If required by the applicable regulatory requirement, the sponsor should provide insurance or should indemnify the investigator or institution against claims arising from the trial, except for claims that arise from malpractice or negligence. The sponsor is responsible for the ongoing safety evaluation of the investigational product, including reviews of safety information and safety reporting, manufacturing, packaging, labeling, coding, supply, and handling of the IP. The sponsor should ensure the integrity and confidentiality of data generated and how it is managed, including data handling, statistical programming and analysis, record keeping and retention, and record access. If a trial is prematurely terminated or suspended, the sponsor should promptly inform all relevant parties of the termination or suspension and the reasons for it. Once the trial has been unblinded and relevant analyses or conclusions have been completed, the sponsor should make the trial results publicly available, provide the investigator with information about the treatment taken by their participants for blinded trials, and provide investigators with the trial results. Clinical trial reports should be prepared and provided to the regulatory agencies as required. To find out more about the sponsor's role and responsibilities, refer to the ICH GCP guideline, which is available on this training page. Now you know more about the sponsor's role and responsibilities. What about investigators? What do they do? The clinical trial investigator makes sure the trial is properly conducted and that it complies with the protocol, GCP, and regulatory requirements. The investigator should also allow for auditing, monitoring, and inspection to enable sponsor or regulatory oversight. Auditing refers to a systematic and independent examination of trial-related activities and records performed by the sponsor, service provider, or institution. Monitoring is the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial, while inspection is where a regulatory authority conducts an official review of documents, facilities, and any other resources that the authority deems related to the clinical trial. Auditing, monitoring, and inspection ensure the trial is conducted in accordance with the protocol, GCP, SOPs, and regulatory requirements. The investigator has to be qualified by education, training, and experience to assume responsibility for the proper conduct of the trial and should provide evidence of their qualifications. Before the investigator starts the trial, they must have the IRB or IEC approved protocol, an up-to-date informed consent form, or ICF, participant recruitment procedures, and any other trial-related information that they'll give to potential participants, and written and dated IRB or IEC approval for all. The IRB or IEC is an independent body constituted of medical professionals and non-medical members whose responsibility it is to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants. Submissions to the IRB or IEC may be made by the investigator or institution or sponsor in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. The investigator should be fully familiar with the investigational product, as described in the approved protocol, and any supporting documentation provided by the sponsor. They have to show the investigator site where trial-related activities are conducted and/or coordinated under the investigator's or institution's oversight, has the potential to recruit enough participants within the agreed timeframe. The investigator or institution or sponsor, depending on applicable regulatory requirements, must also send a current copy of the investigator's brochure to the IRB or IEC, as well as any updated copies during the trial. It's important that the investigator has sufficient time, an adequate number of available and qualified staff, and facilities to conduct the trial properly and safely. The investigator may delegate trial-related activities and be supported by the sponsor in the identification of a suitable service provider. However, the investigator retains the final decision on whether the service provider intended to support the investigator is appropriate. The investigator should ensure a record is maintained of the persons and parties to whom the investigator has delegated significant trial-related activities. Documentation of delegation should be proportionate to the significance of the trial-related activities. Any delegations and agreements made by the investigator or institution with service providers for trial-related activities should be clearly documented and maintained. The investigator is responsible for overseeing the parties undertaking the activities delegated to ensure data reliability and the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants. They should also ensure the delegated parties are appropriately qualified, supervised, and adequately informed about relevant aspects of the protocol, the investigational product, and their assigned trial activities, ensuring what is necessary to enable them to fulfill their delegated trial activities that go beyond their usual training and experience. The investigator or institution should sign the protocol or an alternative contract to confirm agreement with the sponsor to follow protocol. The investigator should follow the protocol and deviate only where necessary when there's an immediate hazard to participants. All deviations will be documented, reviewed, explained, and included with measures implemented to prevent recurrence. The investigator should document and report information on the deviations, rationale, immediate hazard, the implemented change, and the subsequent proposed protocol amendment, if any, to the IRB or IEC or regulatory authorities as soon as possible. The investigator, institution, or sponsor should provide any updates to the participant information according to applicable regulatory requirements and should submit documented summaries of the trial status to the IRB or IEC. To find out more about the investigator's role and responsibilities, please refer to Section 2 of the ICH GCP Guideline, which is available on this training page. Before site staff perform any trial-related procedures, the participant or their legal representative has to provide informed consent. Informed consent is a process by which a participant or their legally acceptable representative voluntarily confirms their willingness to participate in a trial after having been informed and provided with the opportunity to discuss all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the participant's decision to participate. There are 2 steps involved: informing the participant or their legal representative about the trial and obtaining their consent. Let's look at these in more detail. Prior to consenting and enrolling participants, the investigator should receive approval from the IRB or IEC for the ICF and any other information to be provided to the participant. The participant must be given ample time to review the ICF and all other information that could affect their decision to take part. The information should be as clear and concise as possible, use simple language, and avoid unnecessary volume and complexity. None of the language should cause the participant to waive their legal rights or release the investigator or sponsor from liability for negligence. The investigator or their designee should make sure the participant or their legal representative is fully informed about all key parts of the trial, including the trial's purpose, their responsibilities, the risks of their involvement, their legal rights, and what is expected of them. The informed consent discussion and relevant form documents must include all relevant explanations per Section 2.8.10 of the ICH GCP Guideline. The participant or their legal representative must be given the opportunity to inquire about trial details and to decide whether or not to participate in the trial. Once the participant or their legal representative has been fully informed about the trial, the investigator should request their consent to participate without putting any pressure on them to do so. Prior to trial participation, the ICF should be signed and dated by the participant or their legally acceptable representative, and, where appropriate, impartial witness, and by the investigator or delegated investigator site staff who conducted the informed consent discussion. The informed consent process may involve a physical signature or an electronic signature. Varied approaches may be used in the informed consent process, including for providing information to the participant. The characteristics of the potential trial population and the suitability of the method of obtaining consent should be taken into consideration. Obtaining consent remotely may be considered where appropriate. Whether the informed consent process takes place in person or remotely, the investigator should assure themselves of the identity of the participant or legally acceptable representative in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. If a participant or their legal representative cannot read, an impartial witness should be present in person or remotely for the entire process and sign and date the consent form confirming that the information was accurately explained to and apparently understood by the participant, and that informed consent was given. It must be clear that participation is voluntary, and they may refuse to participate or may withdraw at any time, without penalty or loss of benefits to which they are otherwise entitled. By signing the consent form, the investigator or delegated investigator site staff attests that the informed consent was freely given and accurately explained to and apparently understood by the participant or their legal representative. The participant or legal representative must receive a copy of the signed and dated ICF, as well as any other applicable materials. The informed consent process should be documented in the medical record or source file. Appropriate considerations should be given in trials that intend to recruit vulnerable participants. For minors, age-appropriate assent information should be provided and discussed with the minor as part of the consent process, and assent from the minor to enroll in the trial should be obtained as appropriate. A process for consent should be considered if, during the course of the trial, the minor reaches the age of legal consent, in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. If the participant is unable to provide consent themselves, such as participants with severely impaired decision-making capacity, the participant's legally acceptable representative should provide their consent on behalf of the participant. In emergency situations where the participant or their legal representative cannot give consent, the participant should only be enrolled according to measures in the protocol or elsewhere. The participant or the participant's legally acceptable representative should be informed about the trial as soon as possible, and if appropriate, consent should be requested. If new information becomes available that may be relevant to the participant's willingness to continue in the trial, the participant or their legally acceptable representative should be informed in a timely manner. The communication of this information and confirmation of the willingness to continue trial participation should be documented. If reconsent is needed, new information should be clearly identified in the revised informed consent materials, and such materials should receive the IRB or IEC's approval or favorable opinion in advance of use. Always remember that a participant's trial participation is voluntary. They may refuse to provide consent or withdraw from the trial at any time and without penalty. A qualified physician, dentist, or other healthcare professional, per local regulations, who is an investigator or sub-investigator, should be responsible for all trial-related medical care and decisions. Other qualified healthcare professionals may be involved in the medical care of trial participants as part of their normal activities and per the local regulatory requirements. The investigator should discuss the participant's trial involvement with their primary physician, provided that the participant has given consent to do so. If an intercurrent illness occurs during the trial, the investigator must inform the participant when medical care is needed. If a participant has an adverse event or clinically significant laboratory values, the investigator must provide adequate medical care. An adverse event refers to any unfavorable medical occurrence in a trial participant administered the investigational product. An adverse event does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the treatment. Unfavorable medical events occurring in participants before investigational product administration should be considered and reported to the sponsor if required by the protocol. The investigator should report any adverse events or laboratory abnormalities to the sponsor according to the reporting requirements and within the time periods specified in the protocol. A serious adverse event is any unfavorable medical occurrence that is considered serious at any dose if it results in death, is life-threatening, requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, causes persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or is a congenital anomaly or birth defect. Suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions are adverse reactions that meet 3 criteria: suspected, unexpected, and serious. All serious adverse events should be reported to the sponsor immediately, except for serious adverse events that the protocol identifies as not needing immediate reporting. Subsequent information should be submitted as a follow-up report as necessary. For reported deaths, the investigator should supply the sponsor, the IRB or IEC, and the regulatory authority with any additional requested information when it becomes available. The investigator may delegate activities for safety reporting to qualified investigator site staff, but retains the overall responsibility for the safety of participants under their responsibility and compliance with their reporting requirements. Remember, the rights, safety, and well-being of a participant come before all else during a trial. The investigator, or a person designated by the investigator or institution, should explain the correct use of the investigational product to each participant and should check, at intervals appropriate for the trial, that each participant is following the instructions properly. The investigator or institution is responsible for investigational product management, including accountability, handling, dispensing, administration, and return. However, if permitted or required, the investigator may assign these duties to a pharmacist or individual under their oversight. Where the investigator has delegated activities related to investigational product management or aspects of these activities have been facilitated by the sponsor, the level of investigator oversight will depend on a number of factors. These include the characteristics of the investigational product, the route and complexity of administration, level of existing knowledge about the investigational product's safety, and marketing status. Investigational product management should be arranged and conducted in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, and safeguards should be in place to ensure product integrity, product use per protocol, and participant safety. Documentation of delivery, inventory, dispensation, usage, disposal, return, and reconciliation of all investigational products and other study medication should be maintained. Records should also be maintained of participant use and product disposal, for example, whether it is returned to the sponsor or destroyed. These records should include dates, quantities, batch or serial numbers, expiration dates, if applicable, and the unique code numbers assigned to the investigational product and trial participants. The investigational product should be stored as specified by the sponsor and in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. If participants need to be randomized to an investigational product, and in the case of an investigator-blinded trial, the investigator should follow the trial's randomization procedures. The investigator should make sure the treatment randomization code is broken only in accordance with the protocol, and they are prepared and capable of performing the unblinding. They should promptly document and explain any premature unblinding to the sponsor. The investigational product may be shipped to the participant's location or supplied to or dispensed at a location closer to the participant. The investigational product may be administered at the participant's location by investigator site staff, the participant themselves, a caregiver, or a healthcare professional. To find out more about investigational product management, please refer to Section 2.10 of the ICH GCP Guideline, which is available on this training page. Information generated in a clinical trial should be sufficient to address trial objectives, provide confidence in the trial's results, and support good decision-making. Investigators and sponsors are responsible for the management of data integrity, traceability, and security to allow for accurate reporting, verification, and interpretation of the clinical trial-related information. The systems and processes that help ensure this quality should be designed and implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risks to participants and the reliability of trial results. There are a number of key processes involved in addressing data management that address the full data lifecycle with a focus on the criticality of the data and should be implemented proportionately and documented appropriately. This includes processes to ensure the protection of the confidentiality of trial participant data, for managing computerized systems to ensure that they are fit for purpose and used appropriately, and to safeguard essential elements of the clinical trial, such as randomization, dose adjustments, and blinding. There are also processes to support key decision-making, such as data finalization prior to analysis, unblinding, allocation to analysis datasets, changes in clinical trial design, and, where applicable, the activities of, for example, an IDMC. Maintaining the integrity of the blinding is important in system design, user account management, and data handling and responsibilities across all stages of the trial. Roles, responsibilities, and procedures for access to unblinded information should be defined and documented by all relevant parties according to the protocol. Suitable mitigation strategies should be implemented to reduce the risk of inadvertent unblinding of the blinded investigator site staff. Any planned or unplanned unblinding should be documented. Any unplanned unblinding should be assessed for its impact on the trial results, and actions should be taken as appropriate. When data captured on paper or in an electronic health record are manually transcribed into a computerized system, the need for and the extent of data verification should take the criticality of the data into account. Acquired data from any source should be accompanied by relevant metadata. At the point of data capture, automated data validation checks should be considered as required based upon risk, and their implementation should be controlled and documented. Responsible parties must evaluate the type and content of metadata available on their systems and determine which to review and retain. Responsible parties must also ensure that audit trails and associated reports and logs are not disabled, are interpretable and facilitate review, and have auto-captured date and timestamps. Audit trails may only be modified in rare circumstances and only if a log of such action and its justification are maintained. Procedures for the review of trial-specific data, audit trails, and other relevant metadata should be in place. There should also be processes to correct data errors that could impact the reliability of the trial results. Corrections should be attributed to the person or computerized system making the correction, justified and supported by source records around the time of original entry, and performed in a timely manner. Source records include original documents or data, or certified copies of the original documents or data, irrespective of the media used. Validated processes or other appropriate processes should be in place to ensure that electronic data transferred between computerized systems retains its integrity and preserves its confidentiality. The data exchange or transfer process or system migration should be documented to ensure traceability, and data reconciliation should be implemented as appropriate to avoid data loss and unintended modifications. Activities undertaken to finalize the datasets prior to analysis should be confirmed and documented in accordance with pre-specified procedures. These activities may include reconciliation of entered data and datasets or reconciliation of relevant databases. Data extraction and determination of data analysis sets should take place in accordance with the planned statistical analysis and should be documented. The trial data and relevant metadata should be archived in a way that allows for their retrieval and readability and should be protected from unauthorized access and alterations throughout the retention period. The trial data and metadata may be permanently destroyed when no longer required as determined by applicable regulatory requirements. To find out more about data governance and management, refer to Section 4 of the ICH GCP Guideline, which is available on this training page. Guideline, which is available on this training page. The responsibilities of the sponsor, investigator, and the activities of other parties with respect to a computerized system used in clinical trials should be clear and documented. Documented procedures should be in place to ensure the appropriate use of computerized systems in clinical trials for essential activities related to data collection, handling, and management, and the regulatory requirements that apply to them. It is recommended that representatives of intended participant populations and healthcare professionals are involved in the design of the system, where relevant, to ensure that computerized systems are suitable for use by the intended user population. Security controls must be implemented and maintained for computerized systems. These controls should include user management and ongoing measures to prevent, detect, and mitigate security breaches. Aspects such as user authentication requirements, password management, firewall settings, antivirus software, security patching, system monitoring, and penetration testing should be considered. It is important to validate computer systems to maintain adequate system security measures, data backup, and disaster recovery. Validation should demonstrate that the system conforms to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, and reliability, and is consistent with intended performance. Validation procedures should cover the following: system design, system requirement, functionality testing, configuration, release, setup, installation, and change control until decommissioning. Validation should generally include defining the requirements and specifications for the system, its testing, and the associated documentation. Validation should ensure that the system is fit for purpose for use in the trial, especially for critical functionality such as randomization, dosing and dose titrations and reductions, and collection of endpoint data. The trial-specific systems should only be implemented, released, or activated for individual investigator sites after all necessary approvals for the clinical trial relevant to that investigator site have been received. Contingency procedures should be in place to prevent loss or lack of accessibility to data essential to participant safety, trial decisions, or trial outcomes. Technical support must be put in place to document, evaluate, and manage issues with the computerized systems. There should be periodic reviews of these cumulative issues to identify those that are repeated or systemic. Those using computerized systems must be appropriately trained in their use, and system access must be limited to authorized users to ensure attributability to an individual. Procedures should be in place to ensure that user access permissions are appropriately assigned based on a user's duties and functions, blinding arrangements, and the organization to which users belong. Access permissions should be revoked when they are no longer needed. Authorized users and access privileges should be clearly documented, maintained, and retained. These records should include any updates to a user's roles, access rights and permissions, and the time that access privileges were given. For detailed explanations related to computerized systems, refer to the ICH GCP guideline, which is available on this training page. Essential records are the documents and data associated with a clinical trial that facilitate its ongoing management and collectively allow the evaluation of the methods used, the factors affecting a trial, and the actions taken during the trial conduct. Certain essential records may not be specific to a trial, but may be related to the investigational product, facilities, processes, and systems, including computerized systems, involved in running multiple trials and retained outside the trial-specific repositories. Determining which records are essential will be based on the guidance in Appendix C of the ICH GCP guideline. Examples of essential records include the Approved Protocol, ICF, and Investigator's Brochure. The essential records permit and contribute to the evaluation of the conduct of a trial and the reliability of the results produced. They serve to demonstrate the compliance of the investigator and sponsor with the standards of GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. The essential records are used as part of the sponsor oversight or investigator supervision of the trial. The investigator or institution should have access to and the ability to maintain the essential records generated by the investigator or institution before and during the conduct of the trial, and retain them in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. The investigator must ensure that adequate source records that include all pertinent observations on each of the site's trial participants are maintained. Data contained in the source documents must be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. Changes to source records should be traceable, should not obscure the original entry, and should be explained if necessary. The investigator should define what is considered to be a source record, the methods of data capture, and their location prior to starting the trial, and should update this definition when needed. Unnecessary transcription steps between the source record and the data acquisition tool should be avoided. The sponsor and investigator should maintain a record of the location of all essential documents and source documents. The storage system used during the trial and for archiving should provide for document identification, version history, search, and retrieval. The sponsor and investigator or institution should ensure the retention of the essential records required to fulfill their responsibility. The original records should generally be retained by the responsible party who generated them. They should also retain the essential records in a way that ensures that they remain complete, readable, and readily available, and are directly accessible, upon request, by regulatory authorities, monitors, and auditors. Alterations to the essential records should be traceable. Records should be identifiable and version controlled when appropriate, and should include authors, reviewers, and approvers, along with date and signature, where necessary. Or delegated arrangements should be made. Access and management of the essential records throughout the trial, following completion of the trial. Essential documents should be collected and filed in a greatly support a trial's successful management. The investigator the required retention period in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, or until the sponsor informs the investigator or institution that these records are no longer needed, whichever is longer. The investigator must maintain and adhere to regulatory requirements relating to essential documents, including taking measures to prevent their accidental or premature destruction. Essential records should be maintained in or referred to from repositories held by the sponsor and by the investigator or institution for their respective records. These repositories may be referred to as a trial master file, or TMF. The repository held by the investigator or institution may also be referred to as the investigator site file, or ISF. If the investigator closes a site, or leaves a site during or after the end of the clinical trial, The sponsor should be notified of the appropriate individual responsible for retention of the site's essential record. To find out more about essential documents, refer to Appendix C of the ICH GCP guideline, which is available on this training page.